I've invited two special guests.
I'm just like so interested in like the evolutionary biology side of it, which our paper finally just got published. Yes.
Zombie ants are the most famous, but there are lots of different zombie insects.
You've gotten a lot of media attention about those butt falling off cicadas.
That's right.
Hello, my beautiful love bugs, and welcome back to another video on my channel. My name is Nancy. I'm an entomologist. I live in Ecuador, and I'm so excited because today I'm going to be coming at you not only from Ecuador, but I've invited two special guests to talk about their amazing research with me. They are both focused on a system called parasitoids, which makes all of those horror story things, bursting out of body cavities, zombie ants, mind control. We're gonna be getting all into that today, and I thought it would be best if you guys hear the story from the people who are researching it. So without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce my guests. Our first guest is Joanie Mars, and Joanie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Joanie Mars or Joanie King, but Joanie Mars is more fun and probably easier to find since it's like kind of meshed in my older hobby with, you know, my professional life, which is kind of interesting. I'm a PhD candidate at Texas A&M University, third year.
How many do you expect?
Oh geez, hopefully another year and a half, but we'll see. Science is very, very hard. I'm hopeful, but I'm also going to try to be realistic because I've had some problems with getting my project to get up and running too, because there's all these little things that you have to kind of figure out to get your research rolling
together. So Joanie also helps us write Ask an Entomologist. If you haven't seen that, check it out. It's in the reference section below. We basically take your bug questions and answer them in written form. You passed all your qualifying exams, right?
Yeah, so I did.
Yes. Congratulations.
Thank you. I was very relieved. I think that that's the best way to describe it. I was very relieved when I passed.
Brian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nancy. I am a postdoctoral associate at West Virginia University in the Division of Plant and Soil Sciences. And I work on a variety of fungi which are linked by either being developed into biotechnology or their ability to kill insects. So I got my PhD at the end of 2019, and I just started this postdoctoral position right before COVID hit.
Oh wow, so you got your PhD really recently. Congratulations, what a big step that is. And now you're a postdoc. Can you explain a little bit what a postdoc is for people who probably don't know?
Sure. So after you get your PhD, you're sort of done with school, but you still are in sort of a training phase of your career. So as a postdoctoral researcher, I'm working in someone else's lab. So I'm working in the lab of Matt Casson, and I'm someone who has a lot of experience, enough to have my degree, but not enough experience to be running my own lab yet. So I'm working together with him on a lot of research interests of his, and I'm getting training to get to that stage where I'm ready to run my own lab. So I'm sort of in a transitionary period for academia where you finish your degree and are not yet running your own operation.
You said that you study fungus, so what do you consider yourself? Do you consider yourself a mycologist? Do you consider yourself a molecular biologist, a geneticist, an ecologist? What do you consider yourself?
I have a lot of ologies that I'll occupy depending on the day, but I would say that the box that I fall into the most or the best is insect pathology. So that is somebody who studies pathogens of insects.
What do you consider yourself? Do you consider yourself an entomologist? Do you consider yourself an ant specialist?
And we do have this conversation. We have this conversation, and entomology is very interdisciplinary, so that means that you have like a lot of branches of biology within this discipline. I were to put like a label, my general label would be entomologist, but then maybe like entomologist and evolutionary biologist.
So tell us a little bit about your study subject.
I have a few research projects which are wrapped into one dissertation, and that is looking at fire ants and the relationship with the fire ant decapitating fly.
For my PhD, I started working in a lab that was developing a pathogen of mosquitoes as a biotechnology. So we had genetically engineered this fungus that can already kill mosquitoes, and we had modified it to kill mosquitoes faster. that was what drew me into the world of fungi. And in order to develop that technology, I had to learn all of these mycology techniques and also about the evolution of these fungi, which even though I was officially studying entomology for my degree, I had to learn a lot of mycology to be able to work in that project.
Yeah, that makes sense because those systems are so closely linked that you can't understand one without at least understanding a little bit of the other.
Fire ants are originally from South America, like Argentina and Brazil area, and they were introduced to North America around the 1930s through like ships. And I think Mobile, Alabama was like the first place, so fire ants were introduced there, and they spread throughout the southeastern United States in the 1930s and became worse and worse. So much so that a lot of really like insidious like eradication attempts were performed, like cyanide and like really gross like pesticides. Like this is what we're thinking, like Silent Spring, like Rachel Carson, like things like this. Like,
they didn't work, by the way, FYI, all of the crazy...
They didn't work.
Not
because by the time that they realized that fire ants are a problem, it was too late. Because like invasive species are really tough, and once they've really become firmly established, it's more about managing than it is about eradicating. It's like, yeah, these little spicy girls. So people do like to call fire ants spicy boys, but I'm gonna like, typically like all your worker ants are female. So spicy girls, these fire ants are from South America, and where the region that they're from, it floods a lot. So they have this really cool trait where they can like float on the water. So like they'll protect the queen and the brood, and they're just like these massive rafts of like fire, just like, yeah, avoid those. If you see them and you're like on a kayak, yeah.
Don't touch them. Yeah, so a lot of people are like, oh, we'll just flood them out.
Yeah, we'll just flood them out. No, maybe with like boiling hot water, but yeah, you can't flood them out. They got a lot of really cool adaptations to survive, which is one of the reasons that they've been able to do so well. Parasitoid is a type of parasite that lays its eggs in another organism, in a host, and just consumes its host, and the host dies. So that's like a really clear indication, is that it results in the ultimate death of its host.
Your fungus, do you consider them to be a parasitoid?
I would definitely say that these fungi are parasites. They exploit their host to get their nutrients and to finish their life cycle. The fungi that I've been describing right now also fall under the umbrella of pathogens, because they ultimately will kill their host to complete their life cycle, and that's something that they have to continue to develop. Parasitoid basically means parasite-like. So typically that term is reserved for insects which have a parasitic life cycle, and parasitoid wasp is something that just rolls right off your tongue when you say parasitoid. But I would say that for sure they're parasites. I think they could fall under the umbrella of parasitoid if we wanted to stretch that definition, although typically people don't call them parasitoids. And some of them are pathogens. The zombie cicada fungus that I work on, it causes a behavioral manipulation, and it causes a change in the biology and certainly infects the cicada, but we don't have evidence that it actually shortens the life of the cicada. So that wouldn't be a pathogen, but definitely would be a parasite. We like to have these boxes that we can drop phenomena into, but biology doesn't care about that.
Yeah, I think having that clarification and talking about the limitations of our vocabulary is really important.
The fire ant decapitating fly was one thought on how to try to better manage fire ants. But it's a really complex story, and again, like this is a whole topic that a lot of people have done research on, and that has come from the thoughts of other research, which is biological control. And biological control has a rich history of success and disaster. There have been lots of failed...
That will be a whole other video on biocontrol, its successes, its intents, its failures.
Biocontrol has a rich history. So the concept of it is that you try to find a natural enemy of your pest to combat your pest. You know, the enemy of your enemy is your friend type of thing. Because of these failures, we have to really make sure that what you're introducing isn't going to wreak havoc on your native fauna, so like your native arthropods, and that it's like super cool and safe. I believe in like the 1980s, 1990s, they were like, okay, let's try to find some natural enemies, like if there's parasites or parasitoids or viruses or whatever, let's try to find a parasitoid. So researchers went down to Argentina and Brazil, and they found these decapitating flies. And decapitating flies are in the fly family Phoridae. In the case for the fire ant, there's a genus of phorids called Pseudactyon, which are the fire ant decapitating flies. Decapitating flies lay their eggs inside their hosts. So it's one egg per host, and they will lay them in there. Parasitoids are great agents of biocontrol. Parasitoids tend to be very specific, especially endoparasitoids are hyper-specific on their hosts. So like this was like great, right? They're like, oh, we found these parasitoid flies, so we're gonna try to like introduce them, but they did a lot of research, and then once they found that they were specific on like these particular species of Pseudactyon were good to combat Solenopsis invicta, the fire ant, the red imported fire ant, they did introductions, the USDA did introductions in the like early 2000s. There really isn't a silver bullet for fire ants. What I mean by that is that like their management's really complex. Decapitating flies attack the workers. It's the queen or queens that you need to really take out. But these decapitating flies go after the workers. But they still exert a lot of pressure on the ants. So what they do is they alter their behavior. Like the presence of the decapitating flies really stress out the ants. Like they'll go and they hide. It's pretty fast. Like, you know, they come and then the ants are like, oh, like I need to like run and hide, and they'll have like these shifts in their foraging. What it's thought is that you have these indirect effects, and that it like leads other arthropods to have like a advantage because the fire ants are like disrupted in their normal activity. So if an ecosystem's like healthy, then other native ants and arthropods can outcompete. But it takes a long time for this, so it's not like, bam, yay, we introduced decapitating flies, like all our fire ants are gone. No, it's a lot more complex than that, and you know, fire ants have been here a lot longer than the decapitating flies have been, so it's complex.
Can you explain a little bit how we're hoping to use that fungus in pest control?
So the fungi that are worked on in my PhD, they are essentially molds. So they're really easy to grow in the lab. You can grow them on artificial media, and because of that, we can genetically modify them. So that's how we could take this natural pathogen, which already has some really cool abilities, and soup it up with genetic engineering. For those fungi, being genetically modified and being developed as a biotechnology, that takes them into a new realm, which is essentially what we were trailblazing during my PhD. So that's still in development, and is still has many hurdles to jump over before somebody might be able to use it in mosquito control, and I'd be happy to talk about the details of that. The unmodified fungi, they're widely used in agriculture. So millions of hectares of land all over Brazil, all over China, these insect pathogens are applied to agriculture to control insect pests. So they work pretty well for agriculture because there are crops which can sustain some amount of damage and still give you a good yield. But if you're talking about human health, some amount of damage is somebody getting sick. So
Yes.
you can't really have that gray area with human health, and that's where biotechnology can really step in and make these effective enough that they can be used and have an impact before people get sick and save lives, instead of sort of taking a long time to kill mosquitoes. So the fungi themselves are widely used naturally, and these biotechnology, it still has a ways to go. All of these experiments were done in collaboration with a group in Burkina Faso in sub-Saharan Africa. So we conducted these experiments in a malaria endemic village to show that in the conditions where malaria is a serious problem, this technology would work. There's a lot that needs to be done before we can take that from the semi-field and actually move it into the open field. And that's not something that we would want to rush, and that's also not something that we would determine the pace of. This is something that ultimately we're trying to produce to empower the scientists there and the community there, and when they're ready to move it forward, then we will try to support that development.
Really important to point out that we're already using some of these organisms as biocontrol already in systems. So taking them out of one system and just kind of like souping them up a little bit to be implemented in another system it's really cool to see how we were using them and then the process behind that. So
Sure.
Do we expect, like, how far into development is it? Is it something that you think that could be used relatively soon, or?
The standard answer that you get for technologies that are being developed like this is about 5 years, and then every year the answer is 5 years.
5 years.
So it takes a long time to develop these things, and when there isn't a set pathway for something, it's really unsure how you're going to get funding and how those things are actually going to move forward, because particularly with things that are genetically modified, often you have to establish a regulatory framework for assessing them and for evaluating them and to get them approved.
To make sure they don't like go crazy and destroy the ecosystem.
Yeah, well, and to make sure that we're considering the right things, and also that the appropriate people are at the table. You could try to strong arm something through, and you could know the right people in a government and try to move the technology through that way. But ultimately, if people aren't involved, or people feel like you're not being transparent with the development of a technology, then it doesn't matter if it's the most amazing technology ever. Nobody will want to use it.
Right.
So that's something that's definitely a challenge for moving things forward. And we're at a stage where by the end of my PhD, so really just in the last year, we showed that this biotechnology that we developed works really well in semi-field conditions. And what I mean by semi-field is that it has the temperature and the sunlight and the natural conditions, but it's contained in an environment. So for this project that I worked on, we had this natural mosquito pathogen. So it's out of the box is able to recognize a mosquito, burrow into a mosquito, and kill a mosquito specifically. And we had added a gene, which was a toxin from an Australian spider. So when this fungus made it into the insect's blood, we used a promoter, which is just an on-off switch for the gene, which is only turned on inside of the insect blood, which would then express this protein. And this spider toxin, even though people, and I'm sure after viewing your course, they're not going to have this issue, but a lot of people are scared of toxins and think that they're all dangerous to us. But spiders have some toxins which are meant to cause pain to things that they're afraid of, like us. And then they have other toxins which are really specifically targeted to their insect prey. So we took one of those ones that is specific to insects, and we express that in the mosquito blood. So what happens is, as soon as the fungus makes it into mosquito blood, it kills the mosquitoes quickly. And because it's using that toxin, it can kill mosquitoes at a lower spore dose.
Most people, if they've heard of pathogenic fungus like this, they have maybe seen Life in the Undergrowth or something by David Attenborough, and are like, oh, zombie ants, like what is going on with that? So if you just want to talk a little bit about like that kind of aspect of parasitic fungus.
That's absolutely the most famous one are the zombie ants. And the story for zombie ants is such that this fungus, it will land on the outside of an ant, and it because it's sort of present in the environment, and a lot of the complicated inner workings of the ant colony occur within the colony, it mostly will be exposed to foragers and ants which are sort of exploring the forest, which are, at least to the colony, they're pretty expendable at that stage, because if they're going to go out and be exposed to those kinds of risks of being outside of the colony, then you do get exposed to pathogens, and you do get gobbled up by predators. So when this fungus lands on those ants that are foraging, it will recognize that it's on the ant. It will burrow through the ant's exoskeleton, the cuticle, and then once it makes it into the blood, it will continue to proliferate. So thus far, it's very similar to the fungus that I was describing before. But at this stage, instead of killing the ant immediately or killing the ant where it is, it will start to manipulate the behavior of that ant.
You've called these decapitating flies. Do they actually decapitate the ants?
Again, this is like it's going to be a long answer, because yes, they do decapitate the ants, but it's not like they don't come and go, rah, like, you know, like a guillotine and the head comes off. No, no, no.
Off with her head.
It's way more complex than that. So basically, like, these decapitating flies have a very interesting life cycle, and at one stage of them, they need to leave the nest of the ants. So it's really hard to talk about this without talking about the life cycle. There's like this part where they need to leave the nest because once an ant's been successfully parasitized by a female adult fly, the ant will, it will go and it will stay in the nest. So like they normally, like these ants are foraging, right? But they don't forage anymore. So they're like kind of like staying in the nest. And they might be tending to brood or something like that. Yeah, so like the flies like this. Yeah, hanging out, yeah. So the fly's nice and safe, and the flies don't begin consuming like the tissue right away. They're kind of like feeding off a hemolymph, which hemolymph is analogous to the insect's blood. So they're like feeding off the blood, and then they like get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then once they get bigger, like this is where like they'll need to start consuming like the insides of the fire ant's like head, and to get things nice and loose so they can come out of the mouth. So what happens is there's like this really interesting thing where you have this zombie ant behavior where the ant will like this switch. And the ant...
So hold on. So the fly like injects the ant with the egg. The ant is then like, I'm gonna go inside and like hang out for a little bit. And then the fly has hatched and is starting to develop where in the body? In the thorax or in the abdomen?
Yeah, so the egg is laid in the thorax, but it's pretty fast. Like it moves, the larva, once it hatches, it takes about 5 days for the egg to go through like this embryogenesis and stuff and like to hatch. And like once the egg hatches, you have this very, 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 very tiny, teeny tiny like first instar fly larva.
A maggot.
Yeah, a maggot. Yeah, maggots. Yep. By like day 2 or 3, they've already moved to the head. So like they don't.
So they just like swim through the ant body into the head. Gross.
It's really gross. Yeah.
So now they're hanging out in the ant head, and what's going on from here? So ant is like, I'm gonna hang out in the nest, do just like, you know, be a freeloader kinda, I guess. And then then now it has a thing living in its brain, basically. And now what happens?
Once this fly gets bigger and bigger inside the head, it's gonna want to start to eat all that nice, yummy, goopy stuff in there. And then like the last thing they like, which we think that they eat, is the brain. So in order to do this, the fly needs to get the heck out of that fire ant mound, because if they were to emerge as a nice fleshy, not sclerotized. So what I mean by that is like, you know, insects are arthropods, so they have like their exoskeleton on the outside. So when like an insect emerges or molts, like they're really soft and they're like pale. So they can't just fly away. So yeah, what they do is the zombie ant thing. So the worker ant's like, I must leave, right? Like, and I'm anthropomorphizing it, obviously, but they're like, I have to leave the nest, and they just like wander far, far away to a place that's like okay for the fly to continue its development, because there's still a couple of weeks of the fly to like, you know, get bigger, eat the rest of the tissue, and then pupate and emerge.
So at this stage, when the ant is really sick, they're not really moving very well, and they're under the influence of these fungi. So you can, you know, even a human observer could look at this ant and say, something is not right with this ant.
Poor
And that's
ant.
really what gives them the name zombie ants, is because they're walking around as if they've been zombified. So at that stage, the fungus will direct the ant upward into the canopy. This is why we call these diseases summit diseases, because it will send the ant up to a really high perch. So that sounds like the end of the story, but these fungi, unlike the ones that I was describing before, are not molds. So to a mycologist, what that means is that they'll produce a fruiting body. So for some fungi, we call that fruiting body a mushroom. And for these ones, this fruiting body will grow out of the ant's head. So there are some really great videos of these ants which have been killed, some of them recorded by David Attenborough, where this fungus is just growing slowly out of the ant's head. And then at the very end of that structure, the fungus will produce a spore-producing organ, a spore-producing body. And from there, it will rain spores down onto the floor, where hopefully it can come into contact with more ants and continue that life cycle. Because ants have quite a lot of biomass in rainforests, these fungi can essentially completely specialize to a specific species of ant and have a preference for just that one group, just that colony that's nearby, and still be successful. So it's not only an example of this really interesting behavioral manipulation, but it's also an example of really high degree of host specialization that these fungi can evolve.
Once this ant's wandered far away, the zombie ant has wandered far, far away. Enzymes are secreted, and we're not sure yet if it's like just strictly the fly or the fly is manipulating something in the ant. But something happens where like these enzymes are secreted and it weakens all like the tissue, and that's why the head comes off. Like the head typically comes off. It doesn't always come off, but it usually does. Bloop, like it comes off. Like,
is the ant dead by this point?
The ants are dead by, and I've dissected out these maggots from all these stages, so like I have a pretty good like idea of like when this happens. But like this zombie phase is a very short, like it's just a couple of hours. It's very narrow. And the ant, once these enzymes and stuff are secreted, like they're pretty much dead. Like when I try to find these maggots at the zombie phase, like inside the ant's head, the ants are already not doing that well. They're like wandering away. They're twitching. They're like they're not having a good time. They are. They're like, I don't feel so good, like it's like
It's like an alien where they're like, what's wrong with me? Like giant thing like bursts out of the body cavity, like dead person.
Or it's like the Thing, right? You're like, who's, what? Like, ah!
But I'm so excited because you've gotten a lot of media attention about those zombie sexually transmitting fungus butt falling off cicadas.
That's right. We published a paper in PLOS Pathogens, which was on active host transmission,
and that's in the reference section below, so you can read that paper if you want. It's down there in the box.
It's similar to summit disease in that the host is getting manipulated, but with active host transmission, it's actually much more truly a zombie because the host remains alive during the entire manipulation. So with summit diseases, the host is alive and they're sending them somewhere and then they kill them and stuff happens. With active host transmission, all the action happens on a still living host. So there are a few examples of this happening. One that we talked about is Strongwellsia. That's a fungus that infects flies, and it will create a hole in the abdomen of the fly, and as they fly around fields, they'll drop spores on other flies.
It's like those airplanes that drop like, I don't know, pesticides or whatever out of them. It's like that. Exactly. That's crazy.
Exactly.
And so I have a question on that quickly.
Yeah.
Is there like a gaping flesh wound that the fungus is coming out of? Like how can the insect both be so full of fungus that it can literally rain fungus down, but also still manage to fly?
This fungus will basically excavate a hole. So it will produce a cup of fungus inside of the abdomen, and then it will break away that part of the abdomen, and then that cup will produce spores, and then the spores will fall out of that hole. So it will sort of seal it up so that the fly can continue to live, but it will still create a hole where the fungus can emerge. So how that happens and what developmental stages go on is something that we still have to work out. It's really obvious when you look at a fly and there's a big hole in it, but before that happens, it's really hard to tell if these flies have been infected.
Yeah. We don't know who or how those enzymes are being excreted. How much do we know about the system?
We don't know a whole lot, actually. Most of the research that's been done is like on their development.
Do we know the mechanisms that are happening? Like, do we know how the fungus is controlling the ant? Do we know how it's killing the ant?
No, I would say no. So there are some ideas, and I've put some ideas out there myself. But
tell us your ideas, Brian. Tell us your ideas.
this is a story which is still to be determined, but there are some really interesting overlaps between insect biology and these behaviors that we see with the ants. So zombie ants are the most famous, but there are lots of different zombie insects. So I work on zombie cicadas, which have a little bit of a different behavioral manipulation. There are also zombie soldier beetles and many different kinds of fungi that cause this sort of zombification of insects. So what's kind of emerging is the idea that this diverse array of pathogens can cause very similar behaviors where you climb up to a summit, where you secure yourself either with your mandibles or with your legs, and where you die such that spores can rain down on your brothers and sisters. So the sort of theme that's emerging is that there may be something that links this behavior, this sort of summiting behavior that is core to all these different kinds of insects that these different pathogens have all stumbled upon. And one of the ideas that I put forward is insect sleep. Because if you follow, if you look at what we know about insect sleep, which is surprisingly quite little is known about how insects sleep. This is a very vulnerable state for insects. So just like when you fall asleep, it may take a few shakes to wake you up. Insects don't really have the ability to protect themselves from predators or things when they're sleeping very well. So they will typically put themselves in a place which is perched sort of above the ground, away from other organisms. And while they're asleep, they have to secure themselves to that perch. So you can see how some of the interactions that I described that seem really oriented toward the fungus, where you could say, how could the fungus get the ant to bite down? There may be natural behaviors that are being exploited by these.
The fungus is like
fungi.
tapping into that network and it's like, do
Exactly.
this now, pushing the do it now button.
Insects have these periods of quiescence or periods of rest that fungi can exploit to cause these summiting behaviors. I bet that these zombie ant people are going to be the first to figure it out just because there's such intense focus on them and there are some really cool systems to piece it together. But there seems to be a theme that's emerging and it seems to be related to insect behavior. So the more that we know about these insects, probably the more that we'll know about these fungi.
It's a lot easier to turn something on that already exists than to create a whole new behavior or a whole new thing. So just kind of from an evolution perspective, it makes sense that this fungus could evolve to turn on a thing rather than make a whole new behavior happen. What are the exact goals of your research? Like, what are you specifically trying to figure out so we can put that little brick of knowledge into the system?
I have 4 chapters. 3 of my chapters are looking at the fire ant decapitating fly and fire ant.
Studying this at the genetic level is hopefully, I'm guessing, going to help us understand what's being expressed and what's changing inside that system.
Whatever, like when you think of CRISPR, Cas9, and like gene editing stuff, like you have to have a basis for like your research and like what's happening at this level before you can do like more complex stuff. So the hopes that a lot of my colleagues have is that you might be able to find some novel pest management strategies based off of like the way that the fly is manipulating their host, which are really cool things. But I'm just like so interested in like the evolutionary biology side of it that like
you're the first step in the steps to understand the system better. That's really awesome. Well, Joanie, I wanted to thank you so much for hanging out with me today and being here and talking about your research. It's clear that you love what you're doing so much. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you want to touch on, or is there anything you want to shout out to camera right now?
Oh, well, thank you, Nancy, for having me on here. It's my pleasure. I think that one of the important things in science is to share that with other people, because not everybody's a scientist, but our world really has a lot of science around us. So it's important to like think about these things and share these things so people kind of have a better idea of like what's happening. And one of my biggest things that I like think a lot about is that science is a process and not a product. And like we really need to talk more about this process.
So unfamiliar to so many people that don't even know that this like giant battle zombie doomed to the death is happening in their backyard. So.
And then if anyone lives in like the Southeast or United States or in like Argentina and Brazil where fire ants are present, go and like, you know, safely poke the mound, like get the ants agitated and wait like 5 to 15 minutes. You'll see these little flies come and it's really cool. When you disturb the mound, you're like the fire ants are releasing these alarm pheromones for each other, right? Like to be like, hey, we have an intruder. But the flies, and they like pick up on that because parasitoids are very sneaky and they like to take advantage of their host as much as they can.
I just want to thank you again so much for doing this.
You're welcome.
It was such a fun chat.
All right, cool.
If you have something that you're interested in sending to Brian, you can contact him directly and show him all the cool stuff, and maybe you may actually need to mail it for science.
I would love that.
All right, Brian, is there anything that you want to shout out to camera?
Follow me on Twitter and support science and policies based on science, and be good people.
Be good people. Be kind. Yes, we're all about being kind on this channel. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with me. I really, really appreciate it. I just wanted to thank you so much again.
Thank you so much, Nancy.
All right. I just want to thank you again so much for doing this.
You're welcome.
It was such a fun chat.
All right, cool.
Bye.